Hello, Baker International Finance students. We're now in week 4, and I can't believe it's already week 4, so this course is really moving quickly. So just remember to stay on top of things, jump in early to the forum discussions, just stay active on your homework, your quizzes, and we wrap up in 3 more weeks. So this is kind of our last week of 3 full chapters, and then the last 2 weeks will just be 2 chapters. So we look at the materials this week. We're looking at chapters 10, 11, 12, and it talks about transaction, translation, and operating exposure. And the textbook is going to go through different techniques to protect the firm or the multinational enterprise against these things. And I just kind of went through some of my notes, and there's some things I want to highlight from these chapters. First, in chapter 10, we talked about transaction. Obviously, that's the concern that any change in FX, we call foreign exchange, can impact operating cash flows. And as we've talked about before, there's a possibility of doing hedging. And by doing a hedge, some of the pros are that I know that I can lock in a certain guaranteed rate. The cons are obviously sometimes is the expense involved in it. So it's a question of, do I do nothing at all? And but as the dollar amounts get larger, I'd probably want some more predictability in those cash flows. Uh, Also, with the transaction exposure, uh, they mentioned about, can tied to purchasing, borrowing, acquired assets, liabilities, any of those things can impact the firm. So that's why they're going to probably want to do some hedging, especially if the amount is significant. In that chapter, you're going to go through a case with Granado, and they talk about, the different examples of do nothing, a forward, which we talked about, that I guarantee that say I'm going to get euros at a certain price 90 days from now. They also talk about something new called a money market hedge. And money market hedge could be a situation where I convert right now or I borrow money, but if I know that I'm going to receive euros 9 months from now, there's a lot of different techniques either through borrowing or converting right now if I have extra cash. But it's another way to somewhat know that what I'm going to get into the future. And the last, they talk about the options. We talked about options before as, a put option, the right to sell, and a call option, the right to buy. Okay, translation methods, why we care about that. Obviously we're looking at balance sheets and income statements. The 3 financial documents are the balance sheet, income statement, statement of cash flow, but in particular, we ignore the statement of cash flows for our purpose here. And we're concerned about translating back to the home currency. Say that I have some subsidiaries in the textbook, they use an example, I think, where they have operations in China and other operations in Europe. And does that operation operate in the home currency or the foreign currency? So there's some terminology in that chapter, but most U.S. firms are required to report back and translate that into the balance sheet so investors or borrowers can get a better understanding of what's truly going on. So they account for what did the balance sheet and income statement look like after I convert that foreign exchange rate to US dollars, even though it may not be converted, but it gives a picture of how we're doing. So they talked about 2 common methods. One's the current rate method. That's the most common, where it's an exact translation of the current FX rates based on, say, if you had something like assets on a balance sheet and they're over in a foreign subsidiary, I take whatever the value is in euros and I convert them to dollars and I put that into my main balance sheet. The other is the temporal method that may have things such as inventory that may have happened at different times, so I may adjust that so it may not be exactly the same as the current rate. Some techniques they talk about in this chapter 2 is a balance sheet hedge. It's one way, that you could have an equal amount of liabilities and assets. If I'm borrowing 10 million euros and I have assets of 8 million euros, well, I'll figure out a way to reduce that debt on my balance sheet in the form of subsidiary. I will increase the assets to match it. That way, if there's any change in FX, it's always offset. So that's the basics of a balance sheet hedge. All right, last thing just to talk about is operating exposure. When I think about operating exposure, this is just more everyday business to business. How are we doing? We face risks every time. There's always competitors coming in. And it's really looking at the valuation of the present value of the firm from future potential cash flows. And what are my competitors doing? What strategy should I take? How should I diversify? So the textbook goes through what I like to say the short run, the short medium, the long medium, and then the long run, probably 5 years or more. But there are individuals and firms that do a lot of strategic planning. They sit through and they think about how long should I expect these cash flows to happen? And what you'll read about in the textbook is a little bit about discounting these cash flows back to day zero, the present value, to see what a firm is worth. And you had some exposure to that, like in corporate finance with net present value analysis. But now we're just looking at the entire cash flows of the firm. And I usually project out maybe for 5 years, and sometimes we have an infinite rate that this were to continue. But it helps make some decisions. And as a manager or executives, we use what's called sensitivity analysis, where I just change one variable, or scenario analysis, where a lot of variables are changing. And bottom line, I want to know how much exposure I have, that if one of these things increases a lot, say like an input like plastic or oil goes up significantly, how is that going to impact? Just this week, I was reading an article about the tariffs that we put on from Canada, and there's a Tampa Bay newspaper executive that just said that, you know what, we pay about $600 a ton for paper from Canada. Now that a tax is in place, that just went up to like $900, and that significantly hit our business, and we had to lay off 50 employees. So he was really kind of saying that, although tariffs may help certain people, it's really hurting us. It goes back to our discussion of international finance. But it was a great example. They had nothing hedged, and I don't know if there's even a way to hedge that. But now, because some changes happened in the environment, they've been exposed, and it's a part of an operating exposure. Other things that firms do is often diversify, but ways to also manage operation exposure. They'll talk about in the textbook. They talk about a matching technique, also risk-sharing agreements, back-to-back parallel loans, cross-currency swaps, and contractual approaches. So that's a summary of the things that you'll be reading about this week. So if you do have any questions, do just shoot me an email. But otherwise, look forward to talking to our small cohort online, and have a great week.